Today we're going to talk about the APA 7th edition formatting specifically for quantitative or statistical reporting. So this is methods, results, tables, figures. So the 7th edition is what we're using now. It specifies all kinds of formatting things from the American Psychological Association for thesis, dissertation, journal articles, and we're going to use it for our class together. And there's a checklist, there's a lot of great resources for formatting. And we are not going to focus very much on the citations of journal articles and other sources. We're going to focus on things that pertain to the quantitatives. So whether it's a report or a project for this class, if we have numerical outcomes or numerical information, we want to write in the first person. And you can report other stories or you can do a meta-analysis. All of that is covered here. So there's 4 main sections that should be always included: the introduction, the methods, the results, and a discussion. And these can be broken up further, but that's the main order. And sometimes we have additional sections, but we're going to focus on those 4 areas. After those 4 main areas of the main manuscript, we can have appendices, and that usually applies to a thesis or a dissertation, or we can have supplemental materials, which usually applies to a manuscript published in peer-reviewed journals. So in an appendice, the whole point of having appendices or supplemental material is to be transparent and reproducible. And those are 2 things that I really focus on because that's where science as a whole is going to make our field better. So any material that would be maybe distracted or inappropriate to be in the main manuscript can also be included for purposes of transparency and reproducibility at the end. So this could be things like the actual copy of a measurement scale we're using, any instructions we're given to participants, more descriptive that are really complex that again would be distracting to have in the main body. So more detailed demographics or information in table or figures. So it's part of the manuscript, but it is at the end for reference. In journal articles, we usually call this supplemental material rather than appendices, but you could have both. Usually supplemental material, though, is only published online and is not considered part of the manuscript itself. So I really feel this is where using R can be very beneficial, because if you knit your R notebook, you have a larger file that might be distracting to replicate completely in a journal article, but might be informative for other interested parties reading your manuscript. So computer code, mathematical notation, very large tables, color versions of figures or more different versions of figures. And even the data file itself containing the data can be part of a supplemental material. And again, science as a whole, especially with the digital revolution, and transparency and reproducibility pushes are pushing us to include our data where feasible, and the code itself as part of any submission for publication. So again, we usually have an introduction, and a table of contents is really helpful, especially with the thesis and dissertation. Utah State has its own specifications on that, which we won't get into, but we want to be careful in our writing that we have continuity and we're concise but have clarity. So APA has put out this set of guidelines they call the JARS, the Journal Article Reporting Standards. And on this slideshow, I have links that are live, hyperlinks that will take you to more information here. And I've also noted the page number of that main APA manual where this is covered in more detail. So if we're going to focus on the method section itself, whether that's a chapter in a dissertation or a part of a manuscript, can have many subparts or subsections. And sometimes we change the order of these, but these are the main kind of generic order within the method sections. We need a analytic strategy. So this is like you're stating your research questions or your hypotheses. Your sample, how you got your sample, what size it is, why you chose that size of sample, which would be power and precision information. And then we'll have all of the measures or covariates that were collected, how they were collected, what if we're doing depression, which do we use the Beck depression scoring scale, or and information, usually if it's a scale including like a Cronbach's alpha or other psychometric evaluation of the scale and citing where it was developed. And then we'll have our research design. If we had manipulation or if it was observed, how was the survey put out? And then any data diagnostics. So these are things like missing data. And finally, the analytic strategy, which for us here is going to be multi-level modeling, but sometimes that's only part of your strategy. And the methods section is really where you lay out all the details of what you did analytically wise. So missing data, how is that handled? We want to know about a certain relationship, so we're going to use a multi-level modeling. How many levels? What are your covariates? What are the assumptions? Are we going to use Cohen's d for effect size or a partial eta squared? If we're using R squared type measures, there's lots of options there for multi-level models. We'll see when we get in here. So all the details of the methods go in the methods section, so that the results section says what the results are. It does not, the results section does not include specifications like that we're going to use a walled t-test with Satterthwaite's adjusted degrees of freedom. All those strategies and how the analysis are conducted goes in the methods section. Often when we have methods paper or a paper with quantitative methods, flowcharts can be extremely helpful. And these could be flowcharts for the analysis strategy or sampling, subsampling. So a figure can be worth 1,000 words if it's presented very purposefully. So we talked about the method sections. Now we're going to move to the results section. So the results section should start with often, especially if it's a survey or even a quantitative methods, we often have attrition or recruitment. We should have a flow chart of the number of participants and if where and how we had dropout or removal of participants. And we're going to see that on the next slide. The bulk of the results section is the statistics and data analysis results. So this is anything interesting about descriptives, the results of the inferential test, and that we always, anytime we're doing a test, usually rely on p-value, but we should include confidence intervals and effect sizes. So we're not just saying if it's statistically significant, but also if what kind of practical importance or the size of the actual effect is also conveyed. And more, we need to be blatant about missing data handling, whether it's listwise deletion or multiple imputation or any other strategy. That's one thing I consult on a lot, is that if our sample size that we gathered our sample on is not the same as for an analysis, we need to say why, how, what happened to the sample. It is a pretty safe assumption that you're not going to have the full sample in every analysis, and that's not negative on the researcher, but it does need to be discussed. Sometimes we have after baseline descriptive other information, and that would on results, things like adverse events or things that were surprising. So here's an example of a flowchart of participants in this one is for a quasi experiment. So this one's kind of blank. There's no actual numbers in there. So this is an example, but if we go from the top to the bottom, we have how many people do we want to enroll? And then how many were assigned. And here it has two columns. So we have the treatment and control group. How many were assigned to be there? How many actually did receive the manipulation? And then on the next stage down, follow-up. How many were still around at follow-up? Do we lose some to attrition? And then here for the analysis, we might also exclude more participants because of things like missing data or questionable if it's an outlier, like when we can tell that something was wrong with that participant, we know that an assay went wrong or a participant skipped half the questionnaire, so they're not able to, be included. So flowcharts like this, there's a link on the bottom of the page that has various flowcharts that you can adjust for your particular study. So we have an introduction, and that's presenting the information, and that's where you would include your lit review. These are usually two different chapters in most dissertations. We have the background, introduction, as well as the lit review. In a manuscript for publication, usually these are kind of combined into the introduction. We have the methods, results, and then we end with the discussion. So of particular interest for our course, this is where we would put the limitations and strengths. So every study has limitations and strengths. We always have biases, threats to validity, imprecision in our measurement, talking about multiple comparisons, inflation at type 1 error rate, did we have an adequate sample, and any other problems with generalizability. So that goes in the discussion section. But throughout, one thing that, as not an English major, I struggle with is the voice of writing. And in general, in writing for science, you want to have an active voice. However, in the methods and the results section, you are allowed to have a passive voice. So usually we would say things like the speaker were attached to either side of the chair. The focus is on the speaker. Or the researcher did this, the researcher assigned. But when we're talking about statistical tests, your writing should not focus on the researcher ran a t-test, but rather the t-test assessed whether there was a difference in depression between the treatment and control groups. It is okay to use the focus on the statistical test, even though that's not a person. So more of this passive voice. I'm going to really go quickly over bias-free languaging. There are sections in the guide about this, and kind of skipping over grammar as well. Some things I want to focus on are punctuation. And being an old person, I have been trained to have two spaces after a period ending a sentence, but APA actually says one space after a period at the end of the sentence. It also specifies we should be using the Oxford comma. So you'd say black, comma, white, comma, and red. So you have that comma before the word and. Capitalization, we do capitalize derived variables, EFA, CFA, PCA, but we do not capitalize variables unless we're doing a product like age, by, gender, interaction. We could do age, X, gender. This kind of nitpicky. I'm not going to worry too much about that. We do use italics for statistical symbols and incursive scales. So we'll see a little bit of that. So here are some examples of sentences that include statistics in them. And so you might want to pause the video or look at this slide a little bit more. You'll see that M and SD, standing for mean and standard deviation, those abbreviations of those symbols, M and SD, are italicized, as is the capital F statistic and a P. And we're going to see more sentences like that. But right now I just wanted to focus on the italicizing of those symbols. M for mean, SD for standard deviation, F or T, statistical test, and P for a p-value. So we'll see more of this. For abbreviations, you can look at the slide here. I'm not going to focus too much. Different measurements. So generally speaking, we do not have a period other than inches after abbreviations. This is something I want to stop on. So expressing a number. So this is kind of the rule. If the number is less than 10, we want to write out the word with letters. But if the number is greater than 10 or greater, we can use digits. So if in the middle of the sentence I was talking about 5-member teams, 5 would be written out, F-I-V-E. However, if we have 48% of a sample, 48, generally we would put the numbers 4-8 because that's greater than 10, a 2-digit number. However, we do never want to start a sentence, title, or heading with a digit. It needs to start with a letter. So the 48 there would be written out. Other things that we would run or express in word for numbers would be common fraction, 1/5, 2/3, it's okay to have the hyphen or not. And if we're using phrases that are generally expected, like 12 apostles, 5 pillars of Islam, even though 12 usually is okay to put a digit 1, 2, if again it's a name that's recognized, we'd also spell it out. For numbers that are 10 or greater, we usually use the actual numerical digits. Here's another big one. A lot of times we have numbers that we're going to type out, and the numbers have a decimal point in them. So this is specific for numbers with a decimal in it, where the number in front of the decimal is just 0. So 0.86, 0.70, all of these. The rule is, if the number could be bigger than 1, then you do need to put the 0 in front of the decimal. However, if the number can never be 1 or greater, we do not put the 0 in the front of the decimal. So this is the second bullet point here. So correlations, proportions, p-values, those things are never going to be 1 or more. They're always going to have a value of 0 point something, whether it's positive or negative. So for correlation, proportions, and p-values, we do not put the 0 in front of the decimal. We say p equals 0.028 instead of 0.028. And the last bullet point on here, we usually round, as a general rule, all numbers that are decimals to only have 2 numbers after that decimal point. The exception being correlations, proportions, and p-values. In those cases, we use 3 numbers after the decimal. Now, correlations, you can do 2 or 3. P-values, we generally do 3. Another kind of catch is p-values are often really, really small numbers. And so if our p-value is very small, instead of saying p equals 0.00000 and then something else, we usually abbreviate that. P is less than 0.001, and that's as small as we go. Again, you can reference the slideshow or the manual. Another thing I want to hit on, though, to draw your attention is statistical symbols abbreviations. So this seems to me a little bit, I don't know who came up with this, but we do not need to define M for mean, SD for standard deviation, any of the general statistics, Z, F, T, degrees of freedom, capital N and lowercase n for sample sizes, P for a p-value, OR is for odds ratios, and R is correlations, as well as standardly used Greek letters, alpha, beta, rho, sigma, and chi-squared. Everything else, though, we do need to define. The first time you use one of these phrases, you have to spell it out and then in parentheses put the abbreviation. So the first time you're in your paper, you're talking about ANOVA. The very first time you have to say analysis of variance, all spelled out, and then parentheses the abbreviation ANOVA. After that, you can use the abbreviation, but you do need to define it that first time. Okay, so also using these symbols. Let's take, for instance, M for mean and SD for standard deviation. These abbreviations can be used in a sentence, but only within parentheses. We never want to use the capital M to mean mean in the flow of a sentence, only in parenthesized summary information. A lot of times we have a lot of numbers. I'm sure you guys have all read a paper or a presentation where you have a sentence that is more numbers than words, and this is really hard to read. So as a general rule, if you have about 3 pieces of numeric information, that's okay in a sentence. But if you have between 4 and 20, 4 and 10, 5 and 30, a dozen pieces of numbers, numerical information, you probably should put it in a table. If you have more than 20 or 2 dozens numbers, you probably ought to think about making a figure. And this is to ease the human eye and brain in assessing the information. So with tables and figures, in the 7th edition, they've combined the way we present these to be more consistent between tables and figures. We want to, for both of these, we're going to number them. Tables Table 1, Table 2, Table 3, and Figure 1, Figure 2, Figure 3. They both have their own sequencing, but they are both numbered in the order that they are presented in the written manuscript. And then within a table or figure, we have the number, the title, the body, and the notes go underneath. So new in the 7th edition, both of them have a number and a title at the top. Notes go underneath. It used to be tables were on top, figures were on bottom, but they've made it consistent now. And both tables and figures should be left aligned, not center, and separated with double spaces. So it's double spaced like the bulk of the document. So the main principles, we're going to have that table 1 in bold at the top, and then skip a line, so it's double spaced, and then the title should be italicized text with only the first letter capitalized, not every word capitalized, just the first letter capitalized in each of the main words. No period at the end. The title is not a complete sentence necessarily. And then the body of that table or figure can be single spaced, 1.5 or double, depending on your preference. But underneath the notes are double spaced as well. It looks kind of weird in Word because it makes it really big, but this is the preference for full APA. Although I will state, many journals say they're APA formatting. However, they have their own version of APA that violates some of these rules. If you're submitting to a journal and they do something differently, I would not argue with them. I would let them do their own thing. But unless you're told otherwise, follow these formatting specifications. So here's an example of a table, and you'll notice there are never vertical lines in APA tables. They're just horizontal lines, and they should be used not after every line, but more as a sectioning. So here you'll notice at the top we say Table 1 in bold, and then the title has each word capitalized other than and the and of, those little words, and there's no period. It's not necessarily a full sentence. And you notice between Table 1 and the title, there is a skip line because it's double spaced, and another skip line before the table. And then underneath here we have the notes. And again, it looks really long, but when they format this for publication, they can do what they want. So there are 3 kinds of notes. There's the general note, specific note, and a p-value note. And you can have any one of these, any 2 of these, or any 3, but they are always in this order. The general notes are first. And we have the word note italicized with the period. And then in regular font, we can have sentences. This is where we would have abbreviations denoted in this general notes. Specific notes are, you see we have a little superscript A, B here to note different numbers in the table. Those are specific notes. And you use the symbol from the table and write out what it is that you're noting. And then if you were using asterisks for p-values, that would go last. Now, empty cells. If you have a cell in your table that is not applicable, we leave it blank. However, if we were unable to gather some information, that's where we use a dash. So here's another table. This table has both a general note and a specific note. One thing, when we are doing tables, we want to use that 0 in front of the decimal rule, where in this one, some of these numbers have a 0 in front of the decimals, sometimes they don't. It depends on what type of number it is, if it could be bigger than 1 or it could not. And then we also have our p-value listed out to 3 numbers after the decimal. Now in this table, the means and standard deviation, they're also doing 3 numbers after the decimal instead of the general 2. You can use 2 or 3 as long as you're consistent. Consistent is the key. Now here is an example of a correlation table. This one does not have a general note, but it does have specific notes with a superscript A, B, and C. And then at the end, it has the significant asterisks noted. And you can have 1, 2, or 3 as general for P less than 0.05, 0.01, and 0.001. And this is the way it should look. We should have the asterisk, space, italics P, space, the less than symbol, space, 0.05 and then a period. To me, it looks really weird that you have the decimal in front of the 0.5 and after, but this is how APA says. And then a single space, and then you repeat this for the different asterisks. Now, even though we generally have 1, 2, and 3 asterisks, in this particular table, there is no place in the body of the table that we ever see a triple asterisk, so then you do not define the triple asterisks underneath. Whereas in this table, there are no single or double asterisks, there's only triple asterisks. So under the table, we only define the triple asterisks. And you'll see pointed out here that anytime we have a p-value, we also want to have a measure of effect size, which here is an eta squared. So figures are almost exactly the same as tables, where we have a bold figure 1, and then the italicized title with no period at the end, capitalizing the first letters. So that is consistent. This is different than the 6th edition. We have our image itself, which can be various formats. Different journal articles have different specification on what they will and will not accept for the type of figure. So check out the author specifications for the journal you're targeting. And then a legend should be inside of the figure, not outside of the figure, and we can have all 3 kinds of notes. So here's an example. It says figure 1 in bold at the top, then double spaced skip line, and then italics, title with capitalization, not a full sentence, not a period. The figure itself, you'll notice the legend is within the inside of the figure, and then here we have a general note and specific notes. This one does not have any asterisks or p-values. And we'll focus on plots later on. Do not use fill patterns. Here, this is an example of what Excel likes to do, and some older programs do not use those vertical lines, diagonal lines, and hashing. It's okay to use colors if they're meaningful, or grayscale, but don't use those patterns for fill. Anytime you're using color, it's also good to reinforce by using different shapes, line types, thicknesses, grayscale, so that, for instance, if this nice figure was also converted to grayscale, either by printing on a printer, low light, colorblind, photocopying, we still would keep the meaning. And flowcharts figure, this one doesn't have any notes, that's fine. And this slide's about authorship. Again, I'm not going to focus too much on it, but those are the things that I want you to know about APA. Abbreviations, numbers and words, tables and figures. Those are the main things, and we'll pick up little tidbits as we go along.